Every March, almost like clockwork, the Chinese government publishes its defense budget figure. This past weekend, the 2022 budget was published, and it's 7.1% higher than last year's, which amounts to almost 1.5 trillion yuan. That figure may actually mean the Chinese have for the first time ever come close or even matched the US defense spending. One may ask how, since the US budget seems much bigger at first. But comparing the Chinese figure to the US one is not a straightforward matter. First off, one needs to do a conversion to US dollars. Given that 2022 has only begun, the average exchange rate for the whole year can only be estimated. But there's been a clear trend of yuan getting stronger versus the dollar. This video will assume a slight continuation of that trend, and the exchange rate of 6.3 yuan for a dollar. Mind you, with the inflation in the US being fairly rampant, higher than one in China, it's also possible the actual average exchange rate will drop further. Thus, that defense budget in yuan will be equivalent to some 230 billion US dollars. Now, as said, that's quite a bit lower than the US defense spending. The US finalized its 2022 budget plan a few months earlier, but actual defense spending is not just official budgets. There are significant differences in what the two sides include or don't include in their budgets. The Chinese budget is well known to be missing some big-ticket items, ones that the US usually includes. China's budget, for example, pertains only to most direct cost of the military: personnel, as in their salaries, food, housing and some support, training and maintenance of systems and infrastructure, and procurement and modernization of equipment. So a lot of other stuff is not included in that Chinese figure. Let's take a look at the US budget to see what else is there if we want a common denominator. The US budget includes healthcare costs for the personnel. It is unknown to which extent do the Chinese personnel expenses include those. While Chinese soldiers surely have access to healthcare, it's plausible that it's part of the overall government healthcare program outside the military budget. The US budget has a family support program, money going to improving the quality of life for children and families of its troops. It's not known if Chinese spending includes anything similar in the budget. The US budget has recently incorporated the overseas contingency operations into the baseline budget. Now those expenses of actually financing war efforts and overseas deployments are part of the official budget. Yet given that they do finance military ops and provide aid, something that Chinese budget doesn't have to do, part of those should not be included in comparable spending. Here's what that overseas operations call for in 2022. Now, not all that is without value to the matter of US-China comparison. Equipment reset gives almost new weapons, and soldiers get actual deployment experience and training. But most of that 42 billion isn't really classic defense budget spending. So some 15 or so billion might be labeled as bringing some value to the defense budget for this comparison. There are also some organizational differences. The US Coast Guard is part of the US military, but China's Coast Guard is not part of theirs and gets money from a separate budget. Pensions are included in the US budget but not in the Chinese one. Luckily, for a few items like pensions, there is some info out there. Stockholm International Peace Research Institute published a detailed paper on some aspects of true Chinese defense spending. While the figures were estimated for 2019, they can be extrapolated for today's situation as well. There is construction of military infrastructure, but CIPRI claims Chinese local governments reported those to be so small that they're not really relevant. Some one-off mega projects like the construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea were relevant before, but such projects have ceased by today. However, CIPRI report likely does not include costs of building hundreds of new missile silos for the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which was observed only in the last year or so. So Binkov will include a minor additional construction sum. There were direct subsidies to the Chinese military-industrial complex before, but the CIPRI report claims those have reached practically zero in recent years, so Binkov will go with the same figure. Purchases of foreign-made military equipment were previously also outside of Chinese budget, but by today almost all of Chinese equipment needs are met with domestic equipment purchases. There's the space launches and satellites cost. While the US has a clearly delineated cost which satellites are military ones and which are not, China has a lot of government-owned satellites. While the US military is sometimes buying access to commercial satellites, it's plausible the Chinese military is simply getting access to other government-owned satellites for no direct fee. Sadly, it's very hard to estimate the monetary worth of the organizational differences in that regard. It's likely in billions of yuan, at the very least. Which leaves the research and development costs for new weapons and technologies. Now, SIPRI has a figure for 2019 for China, at 173 billion yuan. That would constitute less than 14% of overall Chinese spending in that year. That's less than US spending of 15%, but SIPRI does claim a small amount of research and development is included in the Chinese official budget, so the whole thing might check out. There's also stuff like nuclear research separate from everything. China doesn't include it, nor does the US in its Department of Defense-based budget. Without it, US budget is slightly smaller. So when we take out the 28 billion for the Department of Energy, 13 billion for the Coast Guard and some 27 billion for selected overseas operations, the US Department of Defense budget used as a common baseline figure is a cool 700 billion. On the other side of the equation, the Chinese baseline budget needs to be increased. For research and development, pensions, a bit of construction, a bit of space-related shared costs, and possibly to some unknown extent for healthcare and other items, here projected at up to half the US value. So in the end, the actual Chinese defense spending that has all the items comparable to the US spending is quite a bit higher, possibly even reaching 2 trillion yuan. Using the aforementioned expected average currency exchange ratio for 2022, those figures in dollars are equally impressive. But they're still not even close to the US defense spending figure of 700 billion. So what gives? The answer is value of money. Here we're not talking just about purchasing power parity. Using only that would be imprecise, as its basket of products and services include commercial prices of housing, foreign-made products, and so on. The fact is, China is largely reliant on domestic production chains and domestic research for the military. And while some components in the production chain may be foreign-sourced, most of military research or procurement that is done from abroad is done in cooperation with Russia, which has even lower costs than China. Average wage in China might be a good comparison if China was completely hermetically sealed, production and technology-wise, but since it's not, some middle ground between the purchasing power ratio and the average wage would be a better fit. A middle value between those two would give a modifier figure of some 2.3. Or we could use the cost of living difference in the US and in China. Unlike the purchasing power parity, it has a more realistic basket of products. Cost of living is really a range of figures depending on various cities within China or the US, but its average value is quite close to the modifier we suggested earlier. Curiously, if one compares the actual military salaries, their difference too suggests a roughly similar modifier value. It's also plausible that the US research and production costs have a higher markup than China's, due to being done at commercial rates. Chinese ones may be partially dictated by the government, as defense firms are largely government-owned. But lacking any info, the markup costs will simply be assumed to be similar. It would all still suggest a very wide range of possible modifier figures for China's baseline budget, from anywhere like 1.5 times bigger budget if simple purchasing power parity ratio is used, to a 3 times bigger budget if wage differences are used. Even if one assumes a middle-of-the-road 2.3 modifier, the actual Chinese defense spending basically matches the US one of 2022, or even slightly surpasses it. Is all this a certainty? No, it's a possibility. But even at very, very conservative levels, the Chinese spending in useful, comparable terms has likely approached 500 or 600 billion US dollars. More plausible is that the Chinese spending has actually matched the US one. The wider implications of such Chinese budgets are complex. They don't really mean the Chinese military is stronger than the US one. Even 10 years of such spending would not equate to parity in capability, but the trend is definitely visible. And what does all that mean in the overall context of current struggles in the world, the incoming arms race and the Cold War remains to be seen.